Welcome to another episode of the Cypher Report, where we give you the tools, information, and analysis you need to decrypt the world. In today's episode, we will tackle TikTok, the hugely popular social media application that is experiencing major controversy. Did you know that there's a Chinese counterpart to TikTok called Douyin? The media often conflate the two, but the way TikTok operates is fundamentally different from Douyin. Douyin, like all media in China, is subject to the Chinese Communist Party's Great Firewall, a series of laws, technological tools, and state censors that quash freedom of expression and dissent. The clearest example of the differences between Douyin and TikTok is the information that is allowed to exist on each platform. While TikTok follows in the footsteps of Facebook and Twitter with its terms of service, Douyin must follow the Chinese government's rules and regulations. A key difference that has Republicans clutching their pearls is that children who use Douyin are limited to how long they can spend on the application and what times they can use the app. The content that kids in China are allowed to see is also largely limited to educational programming. But American children who use TikTok have only the limits their parents or guardians set for them. Content on TikTok is user created and children can see everything that exists on it. The evidence for these differences is unquestionable, but what influence, if any, does the Chinese government have over TikTok in the rest of the world? What data is TikTok gathering from its users and who has access to that data? Is TikTok's algorithm really a national security risk? And is it the biggest threat posed by the application? Are these concerns reason enough to ban TikTok? In this episode, we will explore these questions and more. But before we get into it though, I want to do some housekeeping. When we sat down to do this episode, we originally thought that it would be simple. The original script for it was about 12 pages and was a light episode that covered the basics. We just needed to add a few things and call it a day. As I did more research, I discovered that the topic is very complicated. I kept changing my opinion about whether TikTok represented a true threat or if it was all just a big nothing burger. And because of that, the script kept getting longer and longer to be more thorough and give each argument its proper attention. And that's why this video took 3 weeks to complete. I am still working out the kinks about how often we can produce content and the kind of content that we will produce. So if this is the kind of content that you would like to see more of, please be sure to comment below and let us know. And also hit that like button for the algorithms, it really does help us out. Let's now go ahead and get started. Throughout the 3 congressional hearings on TikTok's supposed dangers, legislatures focused on the potential national security threat posed by TikTok. They were concerned with how the Chinese government could use TikTok to identify DoD personnel, spy on Americans, conduct influence and propaganda operations, and more. To a lesser extent, lawmakers were also uneasy with how TikTok chose to enforce its terms of service broadly and the impact TikTok was having on children. But even these were largely viewed through a national security lens. These all link back to the fact that a Chinese company owns TikTok and therefore is owned by the Chinese government. As Representative Anna Ashur of California stated,
"Well, I'm one that doesn't believe that there is really a private sector in China. And when you look at their national law, and what specifically these 2 articles, Article 7 and Article 10, are very clear. So I think that there is a real problem relative to our national security about the protection of the user data. I don't believe that TikTok has, that you have said or done anything to convince us that information, the personal information of 150 million Americans, that the Chinese government is not going to give that up." So
at Cypher Report, we go behind the headlines where facts live and clickbait dies. So let's explore what we know about each of these claims. To understand who owns TikTok, it is important to understand how it was started. The TikTok that we know today is the result of a merger of 2 companies in 2018, ByteDance, which owned TikTok and other tech companies, and Musical.ly. Musical.ly was started by Alex Xu and Luyu Yang in 2014. Originally, the team set out to create an educational video social network, but abandoned the project after it didn't get enough traction. They quickly switched gears to a short-form video content with a focus of letting users create videos using provided filters, music, and editing options. Essentially doing what Instagram did to photography, but for short videos. The formula proved popular, attracting global investors and creating a highly engaged and dedicated user base. ByteDance, for their part, has a similar story. Its founder, Zhang Yiming, aspired to be Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg, to create a thing that would put China on the map. He is even reported to have placed the motto, "Always Day One," a motivational phrase from Amazon, on the walls of his office. He also saw the potential of big data and artificial intelligence well before others in the social media space did, and used those tools in his ventures. ByteDance's first successful application was Toichao, or Headlines. On the surface, Headlines was a simple news aggregator, serving up short stories of the important headlines of the day. Unlike other social media apps, Headlines didn't use social networks to help curate and predict what a user wanted to see. Instead, it relied on what each user did, monitoring thousands of points of data to help create its For You page. Its other app, Nihon Danzi, or Profound Gag, was similar to other social network applications, where users share memes, videos, and news articles, creating a social network to augment ByteDance's already powerful algorithm. Before being forced to shut down by the Chinese government due to its concerns that the app was undermining the Chinese Communist Party, it had 200 million users in China. What's important to note here is that both companies from the start had ambitions of reaching a global audience. Musically dual released in China and the United States. ByteDance went on to acquire other social networks outside of China and released Toutiao in Brazil, Indonesia, and the United States. ByteDance's TikTok was created for the Indian market, and as a result, both companies attracted global investors, even knowing the stringent rules that would govern each application in China. According to Kenton Tebow, a senior resident China fellow at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Lab, quote, "Its ownership is not possible to verify. It has, however, had to provide relevant disclosures in the past." She said that ByteDance has provided disclosures to Washington, D.C., courts, funders, and in Chinese government documents. Tebow said those disclosures showed that 60% of TikTok is owned by global investors. This was confirmed in a hearing before Congress where TikTok CEO Shou Chu said,
"Mr. Chu, I think your company is unique among the ones represented here today because of its ownership by ByteDance, a Chinese company. And I know there have been some steps that you've taken to wall off the data collected here in the United States. But the fact of the matter is that under Chinese law and Chinese national intelligence laws, all information accumulated by companies in the People's Republic of China are required to be shared with the Chinese intelligence services. ByteDance, the initial release of TikTok, I understand, was 2016. These efforts that you made with Oracle under the so-called Project Texas to wall off the U.S. data was in 2021, and apparently allegedly fully walled off in March of 23. What happened to all of the data that TikTok collected before that?
Senator, thank you.
From American users.
Understand. TikTok is owned by ByteDance, which is majority owned by global investors, and we have 3 Americans on the board out of 5.
But members of Congress repeatedly claimed that ByteDance was owned by the Chinese government. They even pointed to the fact that the Chinese government owns 1% golden shares in ByteDance, and that shares gives the Chinese government what amounts to full control of the company. However, from our research, this claim appears to be misleading. First, what is a golden share? Essentially, it is a 1% stake in a company purchased by the Chinese government. This ensures that the government's censure regime is followed and that tech companies do not get too powerful. China typically buys 1% stakes in Chinese companies that do business in China. These golden shares give the Chinese government a board seat, voting power, and a say in business decisions, according to the Wall Street Journal. When it comes to the golden shares connected to TikTok, They are in the Douyin subsidiary, not ByteDance itself, according to the South China Morning Post, a Hong Kong newspaper that doesn't operate in China and has been critical of the Chinese government in the past. For its part, TikTok said the following, quote, "As is required under Chinese law, in order to operate certain news and information products that are offered exclusively in China, media licenses are required for those services. As such, an entity affiliated with the Chinese government owns a 1% stake of ByteDance's subsidiary, Douyin Information Services Company Limited. This is a common arrangement for companies operating news and information platforms in China. This arrangement is specific to services in the Chinese market and has no bearing on ByteDance's global operations outside of China, including TikTok." Still, this is a possible, even downright probable, if you know, you know, cause for concern, which is we will get into later. Let's move on now to go over if TikTok has been censored in general. TikTok, like all social media companies, has a robust terms of service and community guidelines that are meant to foster a fun, engaging atmosphere on the platform to encourage as many people to participate as possible. The guidelines bans includes but are not limited to hate speech, nudity, gore, promoting violence, animal abuse, promoting extremist groups, sexual exploitation, and child endangerment. Much of the enforcement of community guidelines is done through automated processes, and we all know how well those are. I'm looking at you, Meta. However, TikTok also claims to employ 40,000 people in its trust and safety department globally, including moderators in China. Here may be the rub, and buckle up because we have a lot to go through, not just from TikTok, but other ByteDance products from all over the world. Yes, we have examples from all over the world. From our research, the first reports about how the TikTok censorship was used as a tool for the Chinese government began to crop up in September of 2019 during the Hong Kong protest.
因為我哋已經冇晒退路，我哋太多嘅妥協啦，所以更加要俾佢哋睇到香港人嘅決心。
The people of Hong Kong are out in the streets.
呢個遊行對香港嘅未來可以話係歷史性嘅一刻咯，係香港。
Hundreds of thousands are demonstrating against a deeply unpopular bill.
呢個會影響全香港嘅市民咯。
因為呢條條例對香港嘅傷害係非常之大嘅。
But this is about a whole lot more than a bill. It's about the status of Hong Kong and the power China has over it.
Tens of thousands of videos, photos, and posts blanketed social media as the world watched as the tiny city-state took to the streets, carrying American and British flags as a sign of defiance and a call for freedom, even as they were being beaten by pro-Chinese agitators. Frankly, I think these guys are Chinese military or police. But not every post was in support of Hong Kong, as the Chinese government employed its so-called 50 Cent army to disseminate pro-Chinese messages and to try to subvert the movement. We watched this unfold where hashtags such as I stand with Hong Kong, and the HK protest allowed us to show support and keep up with the latest across social media. Well, almost across all social media. According to reporting from the Washington Post and Bloomberg, the protest was uncharacteristically absent from TikTok at the time. And it isn't just the Hong Kong protest. The New York Times reported that a teenager had her account suspended shortly after she made a post critical of China's treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang province. As I am sure you are aware, China has implemented a huge crackdown on the Uyghur population as a means of asserting control of the area and to Hanify the population.
China doesn't want the world to see Xinjiang up close, to see the crackdown it calls an answer to terrorism. There have only been fleeting glimpses of swelling detention centers, but now there's real proof, secret blueprints of mass incarceration and indoctrination of Muslims.
China used to deny that these places exist. But now we're being given a tour. The message? These are schools, not prisons.
他们受到一定的极端思想感染以后，为了就是把自己思想里面的极端思想感染程度去除。
But the more we ask, have you been convicted of a crime?
我没有犯罪，我只是犯了错。
How often are you able to pray here?
国家法律规定学校公共场所，公共场所不能从事宗教活动。
the more evidence we try to gather of our own, the more questions there are.
Re-education is the goal. When doing research into the specific claims about censorship of the Uyghurs, we found numerous examples from Douyin, but nothing systemic from TikTok. These include Douyin directly participating in censorship, helping the Chinese government promote its police forces, the Chinese government using Douyin to spread propaganda, and Chinese citizens and activists from outside China attempting to use Douyin to document the atrocities. Some of these reports were created in partnership with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's International Cyber Policy Centre, an Australian defence think tank founded by the Australian government and funded by the Australian Department of Defence, along with overseas governments and defence and technological companies. Sus! But numerous other reports about ByteDance or Douyin working with the Chinese government came directly from Chinese government documents and independent reporting. One example was presumably a Chinese government ad asking Uyghur women to urgently sign up to intermarriage with Chinese or Han men that were widely circulated on Douyin before Uyghur activists outside of China applied enough pressure to get it removed. Yes, Douyin is available outside of China, while TikTok is not available in China. I want to step back a moment here and just complain about the media's reporting on this subject. The research in this episode was unnecessarily complicated by poor media reporting on the separation between Douyin and TikTok. A lot of times, a news article would say something along the lines of Chinese company TikTok involved in XYZ, but the article was clearly only talking about Douyin. Other times, there would be an article about someone using Douyin outside of China to monitor what's happening inside of China, but the article would call it TikTok. This conflation made all web searches of TikTok censorship pull up results from what was actually Douyin censorship. While this is bad and shouldn't happen, it shouldn't have any bearing on US congressional action taken against TikTok. And I say it shouldn't have much, well, we'll get more into it later. Now, circling back to the New York Times story, TikTok denies it had anything to do with her post. Instead, it was an issue with automatic bans of previously banned accounts, and she was just simply caught up in the wave. Sure, this is possible, but what if a pattern has emerged? To that end, a 2019 article from The Guardian titled "Revealed: How TikTok Censors Videos That Do Not Please Beijing" is very illustrative of the point. So TikTok had instructed its moderators to censor videos that mentioned Tiananmen Square, Tibet independence, or banned religious group Falun Gong, according to leaked documents that detailed the site's moderation guidelines. The guidelines divide banned material into two categories. Some content is marked as a violation, which sees it deleted from the site entirely and can lead to a user being banned from the service. But lesser infringements are marked as visible to self, which leaves the content up but limits its distribution through TikTok's algorithmically curated feed. In other words, the dreaded shadow ban.
I hear the Shadow Realm's lovely this time of year. Let's find out if it's true!
The bulk of the guidelines covering China is contained in the section governing hate speech and religion. In every case, they placed in context designed to make the rules seem general in purpose rather than specific exceptions. A ban on criticizing China's socialist government, for example, came under a general ban of, quote, criticisms or attacks towards policies, social rules of any country, such as a constitutional monarchy, parliamentary system, separation of powers, socialist system, etc. A TikTok spokesman told The Guardian at the time that those guidelines were no longer in force. Quote, the old guidelines in question are outdated and no longer in use. Today, we take a more localized approach, including local moderators, local content and moderation policies, local refinement of global policies, and more. We also consult with a number of independent local committees and are working to scale this at a global level, including forming an independent committee of leading industry organizations and experts to continually assess these policies. Again, TikTok said that these issues arose under guidelines that are no longer used. Guidelines they claim were designed to center the app on entertainment rather than politics. Supposedly anyways. This was in 2019, but there are more recent examples. In one case, the Times of India reported that an Indian comedian, Salani Gao, had a video taken down in June of 2020 after being mildly critical of China. TikTok responded with the following. In the context of COVID-19, we've implemented a more rigorous review process to err on the side of caution and remove potentially volatile content. The video in question was reinstated after being flagged and a further review conducted. Interesting. But there's another case from Germany in February of 2022, where a feature that auto-generated subtitles ended up censoring words like re-education camp, labor camp, internment camp, with asterisks. The German paper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung reported that, quote, the editorial team contacted the TikTok press office and received the answer. Quote, in a recent test of subtitles, outdated English language protection measures were incorrectly used for a German function. A surprising reason. It is well known that words like thought experiment or realpolitik made it from German into English usage. This would be new for re-education camps. In response to the publication of this post, a TikTok spokeswoman added to her company's statement that the outdated English language protections also included restrictions on English language swear words. Following TikTok's argument, the words replaced by asterisks would have to contain a sequence of letters that is used as a swear word in English. This applies to the combination slag, which can be translated as slag, but also as... That's curious, isn't it? In another case from Germany in March of 2022, DW News reported that posts about Peng Shuai were being shadow banned as well.
Tonight, growing concern for Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai. The former world #1 doubles champion disappeared from public view after accusing an ex-vice premier of China of sexual assault.
Peng alleged that around 3 years ago, Zhang invited her to his house to play tennis, then forced her into having sex with him.
That afternoon, I was very afraid. I did not expect this to happen.
Peng recalls crying and refusing Zhang's advances before eventually relenting.
You said you hated me. You said in those 7 years you never forgot about me. I was terrified and anxious. Taking into consideration the affection I had for you 7 years ago, I agreed. Yes, we had sex.
Peng states in the post she has no evidence to back her allegation.
She had disappeared for weeks before reappearing with Chinese handlers and recanted her story.
In a video posted by a Singaporean newspaper, Peng purportedly reverses her accusation, telling a reporter there during an impromptu interview where it's unclear how freely she can speak, I have never said or written about anyone sexually assaulting me, adding there may have been a lot of misunderstandings about an affair with Zhang Gaoli, a former Communist Party official.
Sus! TikTok's response was that her stories were being censored because her name contained the letters HUA, a derogatory term sometimes used for sex workers in Austria.
Chinese censors have gone into overdrive.
Within 30 minutes, Chinese government censors had deleted Peng's post and all mentions of the sexual assault from the platform, citing that it violates relevant laws and regulations. Wanqiu, the Chinese word for tennis, was also blocked, and numerous references to Peng were erased from China's internet.
I think we're beginning to see a pattern here. Pretty suspect. Then there is the story of an NBA player, Inez Cantor Freedom, being banned shortly after sharing a video of China's COVID-19 lockdowns.
I'm going to go to a video now, and it's from Inez Cantor Freedom. And I'd like you to see Inez Cantor Freedom, who has spent his entire career post-NBA fighting against human rights violations within the Chinese Communist Party. Go ahead and play this video, which highlights a situation that allegedly shows some human rights violations inside China. Please play. Mr. Chu, this was a video that was posted on TikTok by Inez Cantor Freedom. Are you familiar with this basketball player?
I'm not familiar with the specifics of this, but I can tell you that...
Are you familiar with the player Inez Cantor Freedom?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with this. You just have to open TikTok and just search for this kind of content. It really exists.
I've read the moderation policy. Let me just quote what you've talked about: content moderation. TikTok has a moderation policy, yes?
We do have community guidelines. That
one of the guidelines says material that in the sole judgment of TikTok is objectionable is this an example, banning Enes Kanter freedom? Is that an example of objectionable material inside the Chinese Communist Party in mainland China?
We do not take down content simply because it's critical of
He
China.
was banned
We do not do
1
that.
week after this video.
We do not do that. And I can check on the specific.
If you need a note, go ahead.
The note says he's not banned.
His account was taken off 1
well,
week after.
We can check on the specifics.
We can check.
Yeah.
After the congressional testimony we just witnessed, freedom was instated. But wait, there's more. Action Institute, an American libertarian think tank, had videos removed and its account suspended after sharing a video in support of democracy efforts in Hong Kong. TikTok claims that the videos were removed for violating TikTok's term of service against sharing violent videos. After the Wall Street Journal posted the story about Action Institute's suspension, it was reinstated by TikTok, which simply stated that the account was taken down in error, a recurring theme to say the least. Now, all of these examples of TikTok censorship are firmly in the realm of national security. They appear to be targeting citizens of other countries to create a more positive image of China. However, there are other examples of censorship that TikTok is engaged in that are a little bit outside the norm for a social media company operating in the West. Let's go over a few of those now because they are important to understand what TikTok is doing more broadly. So according to one of the content creators on the platform, TikTok also seems to have a race issue.
I'm not going to be overly dramatic. I'm going to cut to the chase because I am not feeling well today. I said I was going to give you more about what was going on yesterday. And I'm very emotional because I lost a friend last night. So here's why I'm frustrated. If I go into the creator marketplace and I put supporting white supremacy and I hit accept, it's okay. And it lets me have my asking rate at $500. White supremacy. But God forbid, let me put Black Lives Matter on there. Watch. It says it's a threat. Boom. Inappropriate content. Can't say that. I cannot say black people. This is my screen recording. And this is why I'm pissed the fuck off. We're tired. We're tired. Okay? Black success. Boom. Inappropriate content. Anything black related is inappropriate content. But black can't say it. Let's take that out of the equation. Supporting white success. The same adjectives I was using to describe us on this app. It's allowed. It's allowed. White voices accepted. $500. Pro-white accepted. $500. But let me say pro-black. A threat.
Here's a follow-up video to what we just watched.
And y'all thought I was gonna stop? Here's the next part. Yeah, I'm fed up. I'm tired. I am a neo. You can see it. Boom. Accepted. Fine. No issue. Let me delete it. I can say I'm not even gonna say the word out loud because it irks me. Anti, boom, right here. You see it. Accepted. God forbid I type this in. Let me get rid of that. Let me say, word of the day, I'm a black man. What you think it's gonna say? Threat. I'm done.
Now, Ziggy Tyler is part of TikTok's Creator Marketplace, a private platform where brands can connect with the app's top creators. Tyler explained this in 2021. Reaction to Tyler's video prompted a follow-up by Business Insider. In a comment to Insider, a company spokesperson apologized for the significant error. They said that what Tyler was seeing was a result of an automatic filter set to block words associated with hate speech. The system was erroneously set to flag phrases without respect to word order. The company said that this particular error came from the inclusion of the words black and audience, because its hate speech policy picked up the word die in audience and flagged the pairing inappropriate. Taken as a standalone example, this might not be a problem at all, but TikTok has used this excuse with censorship that appears to be in line with China's propaganda efforts. Other suspect examples of censorship exist as well. Insider reported that TikTok had also erroneously applied what appeared to be a mandatory beauty filter that created slimmer jawlines for some Android users. One TikTok creator noted that the platform's new auto-captioning feature was blocking the phrase Asian woman. And in 2021, intersex creators found that the intersex hashtag was no longer discoverable on the app. Insiders said that these are all examples of a pattern that repeats on TikTok. Quote, first, a creator notices a bizarre and potentially harmful issue with the platform's moderation or algorithm, one that are often disproportionately impacts marginalized groups. They then make a video about what's going on, and the video gets a lot of views. Eventually, perhaps a journalist gets interested in what's going on, asks the company to explain, and then the issue is fixed. TikTok then releases a statement saying that the problem was the result of an error and emphasized the work they do to support the creators and causes affected. Concerning. Moving on though, aside from censorship, another way to manipulate a population is through propaganda, pushing tailor-made messages to select groups of people to influence behaviors and beliefs. We know that governments around the world recreate accounts to push their messages and try to game the algorithm to influence people. Israel buys ads and uses honeypot techniques to encourage immigration, even using members of the IDF to do so. Russia has infamous troll farms that were exposed in 2016. China has what is called the 50-cent army, which is similar to a Russian operation. And the United States had DoD personnel engage in similar behavior. This is stuff we know, and in a globalized internet, there's nothing we can really do to prevent it. But what about direct manipulation of an application? Does TikTok or ByteDance directly alter its algorithm to push pro-Chinese government propaganda? The short answer is yes, but it follows a similar pattern to what happened with censorship on TikTok. Let's look into it now. According to a Reuters report from August of 2020, ByteDance censored content it perceived as critical of the Chinese government on its news aggregate app Babe in Indonesia from 2018 to 2020. ByteDance bought Babe in 2018 and soon after began to implement new moderation protocols created by ByteDance's team in its Beijing headquarters. These moderation guidelines included not publishing any articles on the TikTok ban while negotiations with the Indonesian government were underway. Furthermore, articles with the keywords Tiananmen, Mao Zedong, and articles about tensions between Indonesia and China over the South China Sea were also censored. Sources told Reuters that the guidelines were based on those used for Tadchau, with some tweaks made for Indonesia regarding sensitive topics on elections, race, ethnicity, and religion. Quote, they wanted a non-political, happy tone for the app, one of the people said.
Happy, happy, joy, joy, happy, happy, joy.
But by mid-2020, the previously censored topics were allowed back on Babe after ByteDance began its localization efforts. A source told Reuters that it was a learning process for ByteDance. Interesting. We saw this pattern play out on TikTok, which makes sense. But is there more? In July of 2022, former new employees of TopBuzz, the now defunct American version of Topchow, told BuzzFeed News that the app was used to push pro-Chinese content. A brief history of TopBuzz is warranted here. Launched in 2015, it amassed 40 million monthly active users by 2018 and was hailed as a major driver of traffic to news publishers. But it was abruptly shuttered in June of 2020, just 8 months after Reuters reported that the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States was investigating ByteDance's purchase of Musical.ly as a potentially national security risk. According to the former employees, TopBuzz staff sometimes promoted content by pinning it to the top of the app, and the app would censor other content. Examples include a pinned video of a white man talking about the benefits of moving a tech business to China, videos of pandas, removed reports about the Hong Kong protest, articles about LGBTQ issues being censored, and the removal of Winnie the Pooh, which kind of gives away the whole plot, given that it is Winnie the Pooh is censored in China over comparisons made to Xi Jinping. So we kind of see what's happening here. But there is another aspect of this that we have to cover, and that is, has TikTok been used to spy on people? The last broad category that people seem to be wary of is the amount of data that TikTok creates and controls. Like all social media, TikTok relies on troves of user-generated data, such as likes, swipes, time spent on the app, etc. And personally identifiable user data such as location, age, gender, IP address, and increasingly biometric data like fingerprints, iris scans, and face scans to create curated content that keeps users coming back for that sweet, sweet dopamine hit.
Just hook it to my veins!
Oh look, another recurring theme. But while this information is prevalent across social media companies, not everyone is afraid of what Facebook, Twitter, or Google might do with that data. Maybe they should be. More on that later though. The primary concern that people across the political spectrum have with TikTok is, will the Chinese government access this data? Has ByteDance been caught doing shady things with user data before? And like before, the answer is yes. Now, while we don't have evidence that the Chinese government has accessed TikTok's data, there is a law that compels Chinese companies to share information with the Chinese government. The so-called National Intelligence Law was passed in June of 2017. According to Lawfare, the law, quotes, obliges individuals, organizations, and institutions to assist public security and state security officials in carrying out a wide array of intelligence work. Article 7 stipulates that any organization or citizen shall support, assist, and cooperate with state intelligence work according to the law. Article 14, in turn, grants intelligence agencies authority to insist on this support. State intelligence organs, when legally carrying forth intelligence work, may demand that concerned organs, organizations, or citizens provide needed support, assistance, and cooperation. Organizations and citizens must also protect the security of what is known as any state intelligence work secrets of which they are aware. These clauses appear to limit the obligations on individuals to Chinese citizens, but they do not stipulate that only Chinese organizations are subject to these requirements. The whole article is worth the read, as it goes into more detail about the various subsections of the law, how it conforms with previous Chinese law regarding state intelligence work, and how it changed the law's posture from defense to offense. This means that Representative Crenshaw was actually correct when he said the following.
Thank you, Mr. Chu, for bringing Republicans and Democrats together. Appreciate that. I want to get right to the critical point of concern. So TikTok is able to collect massive amounts of personal data. We all know that. That means it could, if it desired, to use this data to influence narratives and trends, create misinformation campaigns, encourage self-destructive behavior, purposefully allow drug cartels to communicate freely and organize human and drug trafficking. Now, to be fair, all social media companies could do that. But here's the difference. It is only TikTok that is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. All these other social media companies are not. Mr. Chu, do you agree that TikTok is controlled by the CCP?
No.
Okay, I thought you'd say that. I disagree, as you thought I might say. Here's why I disagree. Your parent company is ByteDance, right?
That's correct.
It is correct. So, many of the workers who work at ByteDance, they're Communist Party members, right?
I wouldn't know.
Well, I think, for example, the chief editor at ByteDance, Zhang Vuping, is the Communist Party secretary, correct?
He works on the Chinese business, not on TikTok.
Right. He works for ByteDance, the parent company.
He works on the Chinese business.
Right. The parent company of TikTok.
The Chinese business is called Douyin.
Yeah, but it's all associated with ByteDance, right?
So ByteDance owns a number of businesses.
Right.
They are
you all report to ByteDance. Everybody's part of ByteDance. Okay? And do you know of any other employees that work for ByteDance that are part of the Chinese Communist Party?
Like I said, ByteDance owns Chinese businesses and they operate in China.
You don't know how many, but you acknowledge many must be card-carrying members of the CCP, right?
They're in the Chinese business, yes.
Yeah, I mean, the CCP holds what's called a golden share in ByteDance that allows the CCP to control one board seat in ByteDance. That's publicly
That's
reported.
not correct.
It's not correct. It's been publicly reported. They admitted to it.
You can, on our website, we have updated it, so we can give people more transparent information on this. They have a share in a subsidiary that is only for the Chinese business. It has nothing to do with TikTok. And it's for the purposes of content licensing in China.
So there's not an internal CCP committee, which is a regular thing that happens in China. They have a CCP committee internally inside the company.
I run TikTok. I cannot represent the Chinese business.
Talking about ByteDance. No arrangement in ByteDance? So
Again,
here's the main point of concern. China's 2017 National Intelligence Law states very clearly that, quote, any organization or citizen shall support, assist, and cooperate with state intelligence work in accordance with the law and maintain the secrecy of all knowledge of state intelligence work. In other words, ByteDance and also your TikTok employees that live in China, they must cooperate with Chinese intelligence whenever they are called upon. And if they are called upon, they're bound to secrecy. That would include you. So, Mr. Chu, if the CCP tells ByteDance to turn over all data that TikTok has collected inside the US, even within Project Texas, do they have to do so, according to Chinese law?
Congressman, first, I'm Singaporean.
That's fine, but there are employees of yours and ByteDance's in China.
We understand this concern. In my opening statement, we said, we hear these concerns, we didn't try to avoid them or trivialize them. We built something where we take that data and put it out of reach. This is what we did. We put it out of reach.
Out of reach, but they own you.
No, we put it out of reach by storing them.
ByteDance owns TikTok. If ByteDance is and the CCP owns ByteDance because the CCP owns everybody in China. And so by law, they can make them do whatever they want, and they say that by law, you can't tell anyone about it. So they can make you hand over that data. Is that correct?
Data is stored here in American soil by an American company,
you say that.
overseen by American
We thought that, but leaked audio from 80 internal TikTok meetings shows that U.S. user data has been repeatedly accessed from China when you said it hasn't been. And here's the other thing, following back on my colleague's line of questioning, in your own privacy policy, it says that you may share information within your so-called corporate group. Is ByteDance part of that corporate group?
If you're talking about this, the share of the entity with the share, like I shared with the previous.
Is ByteDance part of the corporate group?
ByteDance as a holding company is part of the corporate group. Yes,
it's part of the corporate group.
Yeah.
Okay, so your own privacy policy says you have to share data with ByteDance. And if the CCP says, hey, ByteDance, you're going to do what we say, and you can't tell anyone about it because by law, according to that 2017 national intelligence law, they have to do it. That's our concern. Maybe you haven't done it yet, but my point is that you might have to. And that's where our concerns come from. I mean, over 300 TikTok employees have worked for China's state-run propaganda media. That's just from looking at their LinkedIn profiles. Okay, so and my last point is this. I want to say this to all the teenagers out there and TikTok influencers who think we're just old and out of touch and don't know what we're talking about, trying to take away your favorite app. You may not care that your data is being accessed now, but it will be one day when you do care about it. And here's the real problem. With data comes power. They can choose what you see and how you see it. They can make you believe things that are not true. They can encourage you to engage in behavior that will destroy your life. Even if it is not happening yet, it could in the future. The long-term goal of the Chinese Communist Party is the demise of the American power, and that starts with our youth. At any moment, they could demand that all of TikTok's data be used to design an AI algorithm with the sole purpose of promoting Chinese interests and destroying our society from within. You want to know why Democrats and Republicans have come together on this? That's why we are so concerned. Thank you, and I yield back.
At the time of recording, we do not have any conclusive evidence that Chinese government has demanded access to TikTok's American data for any purpose. And TikTok's CEO says the Chinese government has not asked for American data. But we do have evidence and accusations that ByteDance has engaged in unethical behavior and has helped the Chinese government with its work abroad, as previously mentioned. First, let's talk about the unethical practices. In June of 2022, BuzzFeed News released a report that they had received 80 audio recordings from ByteDance's internal meetings. These recordings included a discussion that TikTok's US data had been accessed in China between September of 2021 and January of 2022. Additionally, a contractor from Booz Allen Hamilton, hired to help with TikTok's data migration to the US, stated that, quote, I feel like with these tools, there's some backdoor to access user data in almost all of them, which is exhausting. While the data migration efforts, known as Project Texas, are designed to assuage fears that the Chinese government could access Americans' data, and it included team member restrictions, another recording from a data scientist told a colleague, quote, I get my instructions from the main office in Beijing. Concerning. This alone is problematic, but there's more. In response to the steady stream of leaks to BuzzFeed and other US news media companies, ByteDance did something else.
You just broke a major bombshell of a story, and you found out that TikTok and its parent company, ByteDance, were tracking Forbes journalists. What can you tell us?
So this story began back in October when we published a story saying that we knew that a ByteDance team called the Internal Audit and Risk Control Department had tracked the specific location of individual US citizens for a purpose that didn't have to do with advertising or serving them content in the app. Now, we actually knew back in October that we were the people who were being tracked, but we couldn't say that at the time because we were protecting a source. Now that ByteDance has actually admitted that they did track journalists, we're able to say much more about what we know about how this tracking took place.
The spying was done on 2 American journalists who worked for Forbes. One, Emily Baker White, who we just heard from, was the reporter who broke the BuzzFeed news story on ByteDance's recordings. After conducting an internal investigation, ByteDance determined that the breach in protocol was done in order to determine who in the company was leaking information. It has claimed that firing the people involved in the spying operation and other changes like Project Texas should ensure this never happens again, as well as ensuring that the data is never accessed inside Beijing. But can we believe them? What else has ByteDance done? Well, according to a former ByteDance executive, they used TikTok to spy on Hong Kong protesters in 2019. So when it comes to issues that the CCP deems important, ByteDance seems to bend. There is no guarantee they won't do so again in the future. Now that we have addressed the things that TikTok and ByteDance have done that give credence to the concerns from American lawmakers, and yes, these are things that we should care about, we can now move on to the proposed TikTok ban, what it means for American TikTok users, and whether it has a chance of taking effect at all. On March 13th of 2024, the House of Representatives overwhelmingly approved a bill that calls for ByteDance to divest TikTok and sell it to a US company. If the company refuses to divest, it would be unlawful for app stores and web hosting companies to distribute or update the app in the United States. The Justice Department could punish any company that works with TikTok or offers its app to download by way of hefty fines. The app is already on millions of phones in the United States, but the restriction on updates is likely to degrade users' ability to access it. This would be supplemented by measures that prohibits web hosting companies from helping to distribute the app within the United States. The legislation, titled Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act, was offered by members of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party.
Kill! Filthy bastard commies!
The bill has been deemed unconstitutional by some civil rights groups and First Amendment advocates, but it is framing around a threat to national security could potentially help pave the way for its passage. Quote, framing this as a national security threat offers the government considerable latitude when it comes to First Amendment questions. Sarah Krebs, a political scientist and director of the Tech Policy Institute at New York's Cornell University, told Business Insiders. But Ramya Krishna, a staff attorney at the Knight's First Amendment Institute at Columbia University in New York, told Business Insider that the U.S. Supreme Court, quote, has been very clear that invoking national security is not a get-out-of-jail-free card for having to comply with the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects Americans' right to access social media platforms of their choosing. To justify a ban, the government would have to demonstrate that the privacy and security concerns it has can't be addressed in narrower ways. And the government simply hasn't done this, Krishna had said. Though there is evidence to suggest that TikTok suppresses content around political speech as well as others, as we've gone over extensively in this program, the US government simply, quote, hasn't pointed to any evidence that China uses TikTok's algorithms to promote disinformation. More fundamentally, the First Amendment doesn't permit the government to suppress media on the grounds that it contains disinformation, Krishna also stated. So while the bill sailed through the House, the conversation in the US Senate is vastly different. Left-leaning Slate magazine reported it in this way. The senator supporters of the House-passed legislation targeting TikTok have a message to anybody that would call it a ban. Get that filthy word out of your mouth. Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal stated the following, quote, we are talking about a transition in ownership, not a ban, not eliminating TikTok. A transition of ownership that puts it in different hands but permits it to continue to exist. We're not talking about messing with it. We're not talking about screwing around with an asset. We're not talking about disabling it. We're talking about disarming it. But for his part, all Majority Leader Chuck Schumer would say after the House passed the bill was, quote, the Senate will review the legislation when it comes over from the House. There's no vote scheduled. There's no timetable. There's no certainty that the Senate will even take up the House bill. produce a competing Senate alternative, or do anything on the subject in the near future. There is perhaps some intra-Congress rivalry in the way the senators talk about the bill. Bills that arrive from the House, in the Senate's view, tend to be hot-headed and in need of deliberate adult revision, if they're even lucky enough to be considered at all. Committees of jurisdiction will want their opportunity to shape any legislation, and individual members will want amendment votes to leave their imprint on the final product. This exercise in ego management is the business of the Senate, and TikTok is relying on this cumbersome process to buy itself the time and space to execute a lobbying blitz. The last thing that those senators want is young Americans to think that the lawmakers are taking away their favorite digital hobby.
Keep TikTok! Keep TikTok! Keep TikTok!
TikTok influencers protested outside the White House Wednesday, urging the president not to sign a bill banning the social media platform. They say the app is about more than just dancing.
Our representatives tell us all we know how to do is dance. If you want us, we're advocates, we're educators, we inspire, but if you want us to dance.
Senators are already fielding unusual phone calls from people who sound suspiciously like teenagers, giggling with their friends and threatening violence. Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman stressed that the bill would be about divorcing TikTok's relationship from the Chinese Communist government. Quote, "I could have banned TikTok in my own house. My children use it, and I didn't do that. So if I'm not going to ban it in my own house, I'm certainly not going to support banning it nationally. I remember Motley Crue was dangerous with my parents, and they never took away my Motley Crue." Those who support the TikTok not really a ban point to two concerns that make its Chinese ownership, in the words of Blumenthal, a gun aimed at Americans' heads. Those are the Chinese government having access to Americans' personal data and Chinese manipulation of TikTok's algorithm to push propaganda on American users, as we have gone over extensively in this program so far. But for their part, it seems that the Democratic caucus is the most ambivalent on this subject. Oregon Senator Ron Whedon, who has a long history of leading data privacy debates in Congress, said that he would look at the TikTok issue, but was troubled by the proposition that the Chinese control of the app could be replaced by that of another overseer, such as Saudi Arabia. That's because the foreign adversaries listed in the House bill are Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. We have other adversaries and other people we don't want to have control of US data. So maybe we should have this being a little more extensive. But let's continue on. One senator whose opinion matters a great deal is Maria Cantwell of Washington State, who chairs the Commerce Committee. Cantwell embodies the Senate spirit of patting the House's head while pursuing its own legislation at its own pace. She stated, quote, "It's important to get it right. There's ways to talk about this in a broad public policy way without being specific to anybody, or even any company really." Senator Mark Warner of Virginia also stated, quote, "I think anything we can do to make it clear to the public, and particularly those 170 million users who like TikTok, that this is not trying to get rid of the creativity. This is not about trying to eliminate your ability to make money if you're a social influencer. It's about the ability to make sure that this creativity that happens on this platform can't be manipulated by the Communist Party of China." I've yet to hear the most fervent TikTok advocates say, "Oh gosh, I've got to make sure the company stays controlled by China." All the concerns expressed by members of the House and the Senate are valid, and we've given plenty of evidence to support those claims. But is it really practical to force ByteDance to divest TikTok? Let's get into it now. Forcing ByteDance to divest TikTok would not be a simple prospect. With 170 million users in the United States alone, TikTok would carry a high price tag, which few companies or individuals could afford. The details of divestment would probably hinge on a key question regarding whether ByteDance would sell or spin off the entire global footprint of TikTok's operations, or just portions of the app they operate within the United States. Besides a sale, ByteDance could potentially pursue other options, like spinning off TikTok through an initial public offering. Selling just the US app alone could prompt major issues, from how does the algorithm that suggests content to users function, to whether it can display content from other countries. Some of the companies that could potentially afford to buy TikTok are tech giants like Microsoft, Google, and Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram. But the Biden administration has tried repeatedly using antitrust laws to block those companies from becoming bigger. Even if ByteDance could find a buyer of TikTok, China might not let the sale occur. In 2020, when American officials first tried to force a sale of TikTok, Beijing placed an export restrictions on the technology that sounded similar to TikTok's content recommendation algorithm. And last year, Beijing said that it would oppose a sale. According to James Lewis, a senior vice president at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, forcing the divestment would simply not be possible. Even assuming that all of these problems can be overcome, that the Senate would approve of the sale, and that China will just be like, fine, take it, it might not pass in the courts. Now, per reporting from the Washington Post, previous federal measures to restrict TikTok have faced resistance in the court system. After Trump administration pushed to force a sale or ban of TikTok, 2 federal judges ruled that the crackdown was based on claims of a national security threat that was simply hypothetical and would exceed the bounds of law. Trump-appointed judge Carl Nichols wrote the following, quote, "While the ultimate purpose of these prohibitions is to prevent China from accessing those data and spreading information on TikTok, the government's actions would lead to an indirect regulation of personal communications and the exchange of information in an arbitrary and capricious way." End quote. Additionally, Montana attempted to ban the application statewide last year, which was halted by a federal judge who wrote that it had a pervasive undertone of anti-Chinese sentiment and violates the Constitution in more ways than one. The judge, Donald Moley, also rejected the argument that a ban was acceptable under the law because users could still speak on other platforms. Mallory said that the limits on free speech should be targeted and precise, a constitutional scalpel. However, he did not weigh in on a separate legal debate whether government actions like the House's TikTok bill would violate the Constitution's Bill of Attainder clause. The clause prohibits using legislation to punish a person for an alleged crime without a trial. Some lawmakers have argued that the bill singling out a particular business would violate that clause. Senator John Thune, Republican of South Dakota, argued last year against naming TikTok in the legislation being considered then, saying, quote, "There is reason to believe that legislation targeted solely at TikTok would be overturned by the courts because of the Constitution's protection on bills of attainder." The House bill does specifically name TikTok, but says it would apply to all apps the government decrees are controlled by foreign adversary companies. But TikTok and its supporters have said that there are indications from the bill's sponsors that the bill was unfairly targeted at them, including most notably that the bill's document published online was titled TikTok.xml. Ah man, the simplest things can reveal the most things, I swear. Now, the bill's backers have noted that there is some precedent for restrictions against foreign ownership of broadcast media in the United States. In the Communications Act of 1934, Congress prohibited foreign individuals and companies from being majority owners in U.S. public radio and TV stations, stemming from national security concerns raised during World War I. That restriction remains in place today, though it doesn't affect cable TV, and the FCC may grant an exception. But the FCC does not have the authority to regulate the likes of TikTok or YouTube. It's unclear if judges would consider the measure to be similar enough to count as legal precedent. The FCC's ban on foreign ownership of radio and TV stations were first imposed during the time of limited airwaves, not a sprawling global internet. TikTok's defenders also point out that the app is used by lawmakers, journalists, political organizers, and even Chinese dissidents to share their views and learn information. Since 2020, the number of TikTok users who say they get their news on the app almost doubled, according to Pew Research Center, with a third of adults under the age of 30 in the United States now using it to follow current events. Now, this is fine, but please don't rely on 2-minute videos to get your news. That's all I'm saying. Continuing on though. As recently as 2021, the US State Department has advocated for social media apps to be used in democratic countries. In 2021, Nigeria's government banned Twitter across the country, saying it had been used to spread misinformation and fake news. in a way that could tear some countries apart. The US State Department chastised the Nigerian government, saying, quote, unduly restricting the ability of Nigerians to report, gather, and disseminate opinions and information has no place in a democracy. But what's a little bit of hypocrisy among government agencies? I mean, that's ours. You can't ban ours. That was a lot to cover, but I felt it was necessary to provide this level of detail to be as thorough as possible and to guide our analysis. After all, it is our motto. Now, we've already covered whether the TikTok ban is likely to take effect at all, and, well, it's simply not. There are too many hurdles for it to go through, even if it makes it out of the Senate. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that the law does take effect and is fully implemented. Would it be effective at combining? Why does my mouth want to say combining? Blah, 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 blah. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that the law does take effect and is fully implemented. Would it be effective at combating Chinese malign influence? Has ByteDance actually undertaken all these shady practices at the behest of their communist overlords because they are the Chinese government? Or is there more at play here? And if so, what can be done to keep Americans safe? Let's get into it. First, the Senate has it at least partially correct. The ban isn't an outright ban. TikTok could get around the ban's provisions by directing users to update the app outside of Google's Play Store or the Apple App Store. They could also use companies outside the US to host the data and distribute the information. But all of this would be very expensive. It would require setting up new data centers and update methods. It would also likely lead to less usage overall, as the ban would introduce friction to use TikTok and would likely influence the public to believe that TikTok isn't safe to use at all. Not only that, but the US could set a precedent globally, where other Western countries try to also ban TikTok. Never mind the fact that even without full implementation, the ban would be expensive to litigate. This is why TikTok directed US users to call their representatives to try and stop it from happening, which ultimately, frankly, backfired. But let's assume that TikTok is completely removed from the United States. Does this address congressional concerns about the ability of China to conduct influence operations and spy on Americans? Well, the answer to that is absolutely not.
Aw, shucks, Goof. Sorry we didn't help. Didn't help? Why? Y'all taught me a powerful lesson. We did?
To understand why, we must first understand a little bit about the private data marketplace. First, there aren't many data protection provisions in the United States that would prevent China from getting Americans' information. Companies in the United States do have to follow some state laws about data collection and retention, but none of them ban the sale of the data, and all of them follow the cookie opt-in model. Opting out sometimes makes websites inaccessible, and we do like it when a website or social media app gives us good recommendations. All of this has trained us to just accept the damn cookies. Now, every website you visit and every app you download collects data on your usage and follows you around the internet. Some people have even accused Google, Apple, Amazon of listening to your conversations and reading your messages, all in an effort to sell you more products. Even your smart TV isn't free from data collection. Even if you opt out of cookies entirely and employ ad blockers, the pages you click on, the searches you conduct, the products you view, how long you stayed engaged, and your IP address is still collected. All this data is very valuable to market analysts, banks, advertisers, political operatives, developers, or anyone tangentially engaged in marketing. But the data treasure trove isn't useful until it is analyzed and processed in a way that creates the insights that power our digital lives. Digital oil, if you will, because it requires refinement to be made useful. As we said, while everything on the web collects data, not every company on the web is capable of doing useful things with it. But the data is still valuable. That's where data brokers come in as a middleman. Data brokers trawl the internet looking for publicly available data, buy data from third parties, and sometimes create their own through web scraping, a practice that has been heavily used by companies like OpenAI to power ChatGPT. These brokers are keenly interested in people's financial information, demographic data, political beliefs, location, telephone numbers, email addresses, marital status, and more, because processing this data into a usable format is the most valuable. Having these data points on millions of people makes marketing more effective, and this includes political messaging. And well, China doesn't need TikTok to get this data. They're allowed to legally buy all of it. Now, you might be thinking, Cypher, I don't care about my data. I give that away for free. Besides, the US government was already caught stealing it anyways. Remember Cambridge Analytica? What I'm really worried about is Chinese influence and its ability to manipulate Americans. And that's a fair concern, but the proposed US law doesn't stop that either. Collecting the data directly through a social media app is indeed more cost-effective than buying it yourself, especially if the app makes money. Understanding how the algorithm works and having direct access to manipulate it makes propaganda efforts easier. But you don't need either of these things to conduct an effective influence campaign. All you need is the data that is publicly available on the web, the know-how to collect and process it, and thousands of shills to spread your message once complete. Russia, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turning Points USA, the DNC, the GOP are all doing this across all of social media. TikTok is not special here, and China employs its 50-cent army across all social media platforms. Now, we mentioned the 50-cent army briefly earlier, but I think an explanation is warranted here to give more details. First, a primer. The 50-cent army has been around since China connected to the World Wide Web. The group is largely composed of state-backed internet commenters who help the government with its censorship regime and try to shape political opinion by posing as regular citizens who simply like what the government does. The root of the nickname came from the idea that the government paid 50 renminbi cents per pro-China post. Has long been debunked, but the pejorative stuck, and even official state media has acknowledged its existence. Given the opaque nature of the Chinese government, though, people could only speculate how the 50-cent army operated. Many assumed that the government would engage in rigorous online debate, trying to win over converts to the Chinese Communist Party's line. To this end, Gary King, Jennifer Pan, and Margaret Roberts published an analysis of the Chinese government's censorship operations in 2017. They sought to quantify the 50-cent army's operation and fully understand how the government engaged in authoritarian practices to shape public opinion. To conduct their analysis, they used leaked data from an archive of all 2013 to 2014 emails to the account of the Internet Propaganda Office in the Zhanggang district. The emails included numerous posts from workers claiming credit for completing their assignments. What they discovered, and contrary to popular belief, the goal of these posts was not to engage in genuine debate to convert people over to the government side. What the Chinese government did was flood the zone, so to speak, with benign responses about how great China was, the revolutionary history of the Chinese Communist Party, or other symbols of the regime. All of this was done to distract people from the criticism to diffuse rumblings of collective action against the government. In other words, prevent another Tiananmen Square. The whole study is fascinating analysis of how authoritarian regimes operate in the modern era and how manufactured consent is achieved. Actually, let me go ahead and write that down. Do an episode on manufactured consent. All right, got it. But one passage brings it all into focus. From the study, quote, "We cannot know for certain the exact cause or intended purposes of each burst of the 50-cent party post. Figure 2 is consistent with a strategy of distraction. For example, several bursts follow events with, quote, collective potential, i.e. actual or potential real-world crowd formations and related activities. These events include the Shanshan riots and the early May burst following the Yunqi Railroad explosion. Other bursts occur during national holidays, when people are not working, which tends to be prime time periods of political unrest. Indeed, the Qingming Festival, or Holiday of Pure Brightness, has historically been a focal point of protest in China, and for this reason was largely banned during the Maoist era. In recent years, Qingming, a day which people pay respect to the dead, has drawn attention to sensitive events. For example, the deaths of those in the 1989 Tiananmen crisis. The central regime and Xinjiang provinces have both issued notices about Qingming festivals as periods when local governments need to increase their vigilance to prevent protest. Similarly, political meetings are periods when government and party officials believe protests are more likely to take place. During these periods, officials gather and attention is focused on activities of the regime. As such, successful protests can garner greater attention. Prior to these meetings, measures such as preemptive redistribution and preemptive repression are put into place to decrease the likelihood of social mobilization. End quote. The reason that I bring this up is that the lessons that the Chinese government learned from monitoring and shaping the public opinion in China now are being used outside its borders to influence the world. I know because I witnessed it during the Hong Kong protest in 2019, but you don't have to take my word for it. For example, in May of 2022, the Associated Press conducted a study that showed popular Chinese government officials and Chinese media had their profiles boosted by fake accounts on Twitter to push pro-Chinese messages. A similar story also appeared in Foreign Policy in July of 2023. In 2021, the Center of Information Resilience identified a network with ties to the Chinese government that, quote, targeted significant subjects such as U.S. gun laws, COVID-19, human rights abuses in Xinjiang, overseas conflict, and racial discrimination in an apparent bid to inflame tensions, deny remarks critical of China, and target Western governments. The content was posted in English and Chinese. In August of 2023, Meta reported it had taken down 5 Chinese networks of fake accounts. The networks targeted Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, Europe, and the United States. The operations focused primarily on promoting Chinese interests, from defending Beijing's human rights record to attacking government critics. And this doesn't even touch on the numerous examples of government-backed studies published over the years. So if the provisions laid out by Congress are ineffective at combating Chinese propaganda and protecting people's personal data, then why is Congress doing it? For that matter, if China can conduct effective propaganda campaigns without TikTok, why apply pressure to TikTok at all? Well,
that's politics, baby. Get what you can out of someone, then crush them.
For years, politicians and think tanks have viewed China's rise as an existential threat to America. The reason is twofold. First, there is the notion that the clash of civilizations has taken a hold among the American right. This is the idea when two global powers of different moral and political philosophies compete for resources, that they inevitably come into conflict. Great powers doctrine, balance of powers, yada yada yada. Similarly, there is the idea that China's governing philosophy is antithetical to liberal Western democracy, and that if it became dominant in the world, it would be a disaster. Then there is, well, let's let Cartman say.
Sweetie, are you having nightmares about the Chinese again?
They're gonna take over the world. Too many of them. No, leave us alone.
I'm not just being glib here. A good amount of the animating force behind this is simply fear of China overtaking America and subjugating it. The two combined can create a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where conflict is inevitable. This doesn't mean that all concern over China's rise is unwarranted, or that we shouldn't be concerned when China tries to spread propaganda or make alliances that are contrary to liberal values or American interest. But we need to be careful on how we handle this disagreements, lest we fall into outright conflict. We don't want to be overreactive when China does something we don't like, but we can't just let China bully its neighbors or spread propaganda without some sort of consequence. This includes outright banning TikTok, which won't be effective or protect American interest. It could also backfire by decreasing trust in our institutions, and China would be in the right to ban an application or a company from its market that would damage American companies similarly. For its part, China is pursuing policy that is counter to its interest as well, by squeezing TikTok in obvious ways like it has done with headlines, top buzz, censoring TikTok in Hong Kong, or suppressing messages of feng shui. It gives American politicians the ammunition they need to push for draconian measures like banning TikTok in the United States, which would cost a Chinese firm billions of dollars. But as Dwight said,
That's politics, baby.
But let's get back to TikTok though. I think I've made the case in this video that TikTok has bent, at least at times, to Chinese government pressure to influence discourse that transpires on its platform. So the question then is, why? We know from previous statements that TikTok, at least originally, didn't want TikTok to become a place for political discourse. But we all know that spending any time on the internet, that political discourse is inevitable once a platform reaches critical mass. There's no escaping it. It's like a law or something. We also know that TikTok has at least tried to assuage these justified fears by localizing moderation teams, following laws in countries they operate, moving data out of Beijing, etc. These steps are meaningful. They cost money and were undertaken after China became more aggressive in trying to assert control over Douyin and other ByteDance subsidiaries. But they still bent. What gives? A May 2023 article from Forbes is illustrative of the problem. The article, TikTok Parent ByteDance's Sensitive Words Tool Monitors Discussion in China, Trump, and Uyghurs, discusses how TikTok uses lists for increased moderation consideration or to outright ban content. Forbes found more than 50 lists that explicitly mentioned TikTok or the US, others that explicitly referenced Douyin and Taoqiao, and others that did not mention a particular platform. This likely means that some of these lists were explicitly used for TikTok at the time that they were created. Of special note are lists titled TikTok audio sensitive words in Tibet region, special prohibited words in Z and Pang, sensitive words in Douyin videos in Zhejiang, theming strategies on Uyghur Han couples, thematic strategy for China's strategic policy, and local life, Taiwan independence, and Hong Kong. All of these lists are things that the Chinese government would be concerned with, and we have evidence of their suppression on TikTok. But that isn't everything. Included were two lists, Trump-directed prohibited words and Putin-directed prohibited words. The plain English reading of these lists is clear, but TikTok refused to comment on what they mean. We do know that TikTok has banned information in Russia that Russian government does not like, but we don't know much more than that. Furthermore, according to Forbes, quote, an internal guide tool, which appears to be written by China-based employees of ByteDance and its Beijing subsidiary Jinyuan Hongdang, describes its global core vocabulary, or common bottom line sensitive words with high risk, as well as its global commonly used thesaurus, containing fully classified illegal vocabulary. The document says that systems was built in 2017 to help detect, evaluate, and recall these words across ByteDance products because they may bring risks to the company's safety, reputation, and revenue. The business side shall prevail. End quote. Ah, there it is.
That's a terrific story. And we have newspaper people on the payroll, don't we, Tom? They might like a story like that.
They might. They just might.
It's not personal, Sonny. It's strictly business.
Earlier in this episode, we mentioned instances of TikTok banning mentions of LGBTQ issues, then quickly backtracking. We gave examples of how BLM and issues of particular importance to Black people were suppressed and then not, and that there was evidence that TikTok automatically applied a beauty filter to users' videos that had not used it. We also know that TikTok explicitly worked with repressive governments to keep apps available in those countries, similar to how Apple and Microsoft worked with China to have access to the Chinese market. Then there are numerous instances of TikTok banning someone that may have pissed off the Chinese government, and then backtracking once the public or Congress became aware. And, at least from what I could tell, there aren't a lot of instances of TikTok overtly bending to China. Much of the research for this episode was directed to trying to find explicit evidence of the Chinese government directing TikTok to follow some sort of protocol, and I grabbed the most credible examples I could find. As far as evidence of Chinese influence on TikTok's algorithm, there was a study performed by the Network Contagion Research Institute at Reuters University. The study compared hashtags used between Instagram and TikTok to try to gauge if there was any manipulation, and found that hashtags that are sensitive to the Chinese government were notably absent. But in my estimation, the study is inconclusive, because TikTok is a younger app, has a younger user base, and hashtags aren't as widely used from what I've seen. A cursory view of video metrics on these topics does point to more questions though, and the research that they did was quite in-depth, so the subject warrants, well, more study. Anyways, it does appear to me that ByteDance does bend to Chinese pressure for the same reason why Meta, Microsoft, and Twitter will acquiesce to work with governments. American companies do have a different idea of what a proper working relationship with the government is, and the United States does have laws in place that guarantee some privacy rights. The Fourth Amendment does exist after all, but at the end of the day, these companies will do what they believe is needed to protect their bottom line, and in the case of ByteDance, their people.
It's nothing personal, Jack. It's just good business.
So, what can be done? Throughout this video, we've taken an in-depth look at all the issues plaguing TikTok and the legitimate concerns that have given way to a potential ban. But we've also learned that the ban won't be effective in combating Chinese malign influence, won't protect Americans' data from being accessed by the Chinese government or anyone else, and could potentially backfire by leading to a tit-for-tat reprisal that damages both parties. So if the ban is ineffective, what can be done instead?
It's an attempt to make TikTok better. Tic-tac-toe, a winner.
There are at least 3 practical things the US government can do to deal with the particular issues surrounding TikTok and combat foreign influence through social media more broadly. First among them is the passage of a House bill that received a resounding 414 yes votes just a week after the TikTok bill. According to The Verge, H.R. 7520, Protecting Americans' Data from Foreign Adversaries Act of 2024, would prohibit data brokers from transferring personally identifiable sensitive data of United States individuals to foreign adversaries. The reason why it says United States individuals is because it will include companies as well as citizens. The list of countries includes China, along with Hong Kong and Macau, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela. Violations of the act, should it become law, would be enforced by Federal Trade Commission. Such data includes biometric and genetic information, social security numbers, health diagnoses or treatments, and precise geolocation data. Unlike the TikTok bill, this one does not name an individual company. It imposes a broad limit on data brokers' ability to sell, license, rent, trade, transfer, release, disclose, provide access to, or otherwise make available sensitive data of a United States individual. H.R. 7520 followed an executive order from President Biden and contains many of the EO's provisions. Per reporting from CNBC News, the executive order directs the Department of Justice to issue several regulations intended to protect sensitive data. It also instructs the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice to enact security standards intended to prevent hostile countries from commercially obtaining sensitive data on Americans through means like investment, vendor contracts, and employment relationships. Provisions of the EO will be open for public comment before any new regulations are established. Passing H.R. 7520 into law would be a solid step in the right direction. However, the bill faces the same uphill climb in the Senate that the TikTok bill does. And it's not as comprehensive as one might like. It doesn't include IP addresses, it doesn't include birthdays and things like that. These are other parts of data that are sensitive in nature and can give insight into how Americans act that maybe foreign governments in general shouldn't have. But let's go on. Then there is Project Texas, which we touched on earlier. TikTok has engaged with CFI US and US-based data host Oracle on this effort, which is intended to firewall off some data about US TikTok users from ByteDance's leadership in Beijing. Earlier, BuzzFeed News reported, and then in a response letter from 9 US senators, TikTok confirmed that the company has allowed and will continue to allow some ByteDance employees in China to access US user data. As reported by Lawfare blog, the few lawmakers who have referred to Project Texas have all dismissed it out of hand, while neglecting to mention any specific feature that they consider problematic, or identifying any possible ways to address any deficiencies. Project Texas was designed to address 3 main risks. First, that the US user data could be accessed by the Chinese government. Second, the Chinese government could influence content distribution on the platform. And third, that there would be insufficient transparency to understand and identify future risks as they arose. In order to address risk of data access, Project Texas created a US subsidiary called US Data Security, or USDS, to manage US user data. USDS would store data on Oracle Cloud infrastructure, and the new subsidiary would be staffed by US-based employees. Data stored in USDS could flow out of the United States in a limited set of circumstances, such as when a US user messages someone based outside the United States or posted a video globally. To address the risk that the Chinese government could influence the content, TikTok would house the key content moderation functions within USDS, including trust and safety and user operations teams. Oracle would inspect source code within USDS, and TikTok's recommendation algorithm would be subject to review by third-party auditors. Now, the reality of the tech sector is that eliminating risk is an impossible fantasy, though. Companies that devote billions of dollars to security can still be hacked by foreign adversaries. Companies that carefully vet each employee can still be victimized by rogue employees. And companies that store sensitive data still suffer security breaches. If the risks cannot be entirely eliminated, they can be minimized, though, and that's exactly why Project Texas was created. Establishing USDS and staffing it with US employees provided some insulation from foreign influence. Putting responsibility for storing and protecting US user data in the hands of Oracle, a US company, reduced the chances that the data could surreptitiously flow to China. Allowing source code review and giving the US government a significant monitoring role reduced the chances that TikTok could threaten US national security without authorities ever becoming aware of the threat. According to TikTok, all of these Project Texas features were deployed or developed in the process of negotiation with CFI US as a means of addressing US government concerns, which are legitimate concerns. Whether or not these assertions about Project Texas' potential impact on risk are accurate, perhaps the central promise of Project Texas was that it created a public policy canvas for a debate about the specific tool that could be used to combat national security risk. And it is why Project Texas should have been strengthened and been taken seriously. But the new US legislation ignores the privacy elephant in the room. Despite pressure from many consumer groups, users, civil liberties groups, and even companies, Congress has failed to pass federal privacy law. So even if the TikTok bill becomes law, it won't protect users' online privacy when they use other apps and other tech products. Was it problematic to permit US user data to leave USDS in certain circumstances? The US government could require USDS to create a version of TikTok that walled off users from the rest of the world. Did it seem unlikely that a single auditor could detect content moderation manipulation, empower a broader and more diverse group of auditors, perhaps including researchers who have already demonstrated an ability to review TikTok's code for foreign influence, to access and review the company's code and content practices? Lawmakers never seem to wrestle with these possibilities, with the House instead choosing to pass legislation that presumes both that TikTok is guilty and that no remedy is possible aside from a sale or a ban. As we detailed in our opening of this episode, there's little public evidence that legislatures came to these conclusions after considering any alternatives. If the bill passes, the president has indicated that he would sign it, but even if he does, it will undoubtedly get tied up in years-long litigation. It is unlikely TikTok influencers will lose their influence at the hands of the US government anytime soon. Now, lastly, the US government could pass federal legislation to implement EU's General Data Protection Regulations, or the GDPR. Per reporting from Reuters, GDPR is a comprehensive regulation that sets the standards for acquiring, managing, and processing the personal data of EU citizens and their residents. Within the scope of the GDPR, personal data is any information that links to an individual's natural persons or data subject. Most importantly, the GDPR contains a regulation that directs no organization can collect, store, or use personal data without the explicit consent of the data subject. Similar US data protection laws limit regulated data to financial or health information, while the GDPR protects and regulates various sectors of information that can be tied to a data subject, including location information, IP addresses, and cookie data. 5 US states have passed laws like the GDPR, including California, Connecticut, Colorado, Utah, and Virginia. These laws contain much of the regulation laid out in the GDPR. 13 states have introduced legislation, and 9 other states have signed similar legislation, but have not yet enacted these laws. Should TikTok legislation pass or fail, it's obvious that data privacy laws in this country are changing, and that Congress should follow suit in a similar vein. We'll end this episode where we began, the question of whether TikTok poses a unique risk to US national security. According to William Ivania, the former head of counterintelligence for the US government, TikTok's Chinese ownership is an issue. He told Forbes that the difference is that stateside, the NSA doesn't work with Google and CIA doesn't work with Microsoft. The difference is the fundamental issue of ByteDance being subservient to the government and the Ministry of State Security of China. Yes, Facebook and Google do all the same things to protect their global assets on their platform, but they're not beholden to the CIA or the NSA. Wait, really? I think Edward Snowden would like to have a word.
Maybe a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch.
But they won't always be our son of a bitch. Social media companies have already shown that they are more than happy to put their bottom line above American values. It is for that reason that we made the practical solution suggestions we just did. Absent that, there's also what you can do yourself. As former National Security Agency General Counsel Glenn Gerstel said, quote, "We all know that social media is public, but we forget that what we say can have consequences. What if there was a Ministry of State Security version of Google that just looked through the web and kept track of every time someone mentioned Tiananmen Square? If you're doing something out in public, meaning on a public-facing website, not only are you subject to scrutiny by the app itself, but you're also subject to scrutiny beyond the control of the app by anybody who has access to the public web. And they could do whatever they please in tracking you." Wise words, to say the least. Which reminds me, we have to do our episode about AI soon as well. Well, thank you everybody so much for joining us for this episode. It did take us a lot of time to put together this information, cut up this video, and produce it all for you. We know you liked what you heard because you're still with us now, so please hit that like button for the algorithms. And join us next week where we give you the tools, information, and analysis you need to decrypt the world.